Hi, and welcome back. In this objective, learning objective 4 for chapter 4, we're going to put demand and supply together. So we're going to look at not only the buyers, but suppliers too. We'll see that intersection between buyers and sellers, where buyers are willing and able, sellers are willing and able, at that price is what we call price equilibrium and quantity equilibrium. Now, all of these demand and supply curves I've been showing you are snapshots in time because prices change, as do the number of buyers, the number of suppliers. So these curves are always moving. The other thing is you'll see that we use straight lines. That's not actually how it happens in real life. We actually have to impose straight lines or learn how to work with curvilinear shapes. So it makes the math a lot more complicated. But because we're learning, right, we're going to start with the baby steps and we're just going to impose linearity on all of these things. Now, again, some of the formulas are different when you're working with curves, but we can use ordinary least squares and ensure that we abide by all of the properties to make that happen. So let's go ahead and jump into learning objective 4. So what we're going to start with is talking a little bit about where equilibrium happens. Okay. All right, so we're going to take a look at how supply and demand set the price and the quantity. If you'll remember that we looked at a couple of different ways to look at demand and supply. So in equilibrium, what equilibrium is basically where the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. In a graph, it's where the two intersect. So if this is a demand curve, this is a supply curve, we can see that price equilibrium would be right here and quantity equilibrium would be right here. We're going to look at that again in just a moment. Now, if we had a table, all we have to do is to look down the table and see where quantity demanded and quantity supply are the same, and that is our price equilibrium. Our quantity equilibrium in this case would be 15. Okay, so here's the graph. Again, this is the demand curve represented by buyers. Remember, this is a bunch of buyers, and they're standing in line based upon their willingness and ability to pay. So again, when we look at this, the buyers up here are a little more willing and able, okay, because they're willing to pay a higher price. If we look at the suppliers, they too are a bunch of suppliers standing in line. And these suppliers up here, because we're kind of paralleling supply to cost right now, these suppliers have a higher cost than what these suppliers down here do. Okay, so what I want to show you is where these two intersect is where the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. So now we're going to say Q sub E, okay, for equilibrium. Our price equilibrium will be right here. Now, why I'm showing you this is because I want you to understand that the buyers that are actually active in the market are willing and able are anyone that is above the price equilibrium. So all of this portion of the demand curve are active buyers and sellers. These individuals are not because they are either unwilling or unable to purchase at the equilibrium price. Likewise, the suppliers, which have lower cost than price, so all of these individuals down here are the active portions of the supply curve. These individuals, either their cost is too high or they're unwilling to supply to the market. If you're thinking about this and saying, well, if supply is cost, then the difference between, say, we'll call this supplier B right here, I'll make it really big. If we look at the difference between the cost and the price, that actually is their profit that they're getting on a per unit basis. So just a little something to keep in mind as we move forward. So right now, when you're given a demand and supply curve, the very first thing you want to do is to find equilibrium. That's your first step in anything, because that tells you where it started off at and where the market is in balance, okay, between the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. Okay? All right. So here again, just looking at, here's our price of ice cream cones and the quantity of ice cream cones. We can see in this graph where the two intersect, where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. If we drop that down, we see that the quantity equilibrium, or Q sub E, ends up being 7, and the price equilibrium is 4. So P sub E, price equilibrium is 4, quantity equilibrium is 7. Now again, this is a snapshot in time because things are always moving. So let's imagine for a moment, and I'm going to take that $4 we just had, and I'm going to impose it on this graph. So I'm going to say $4, P sub E, and I'm going to drop this one down, and I'm going to say Q sub E for quantity equilibrium. I think that was 7. Now, what happens if the market is not in equilibrium? So the first one I want to show you is a surplus. A surplus is any price that's above equilibrium. So let's say we have a price of $6, okay? If we follow that $6 over, we hit demand here. We're going to drop that down. And notice again, remember our origin is right here. So this is 0, right? 0, 0. So that means that the quantity demanded here is something less than 7. And I'll just make up a number, let's say 5, okay? Now we're going to take that same price and we're going to follow it over to the supply curve. Excuse me. Here, we're going to drop it down. And we notice now that the quantity supplied is something greater than 7. So the quantity supplied, let's say, is 9. Now, because the price is above equilibrium, okay, so P is actually above P sub E, we end up with a surplus because the quantity supplied here at 9, that means that we have 9 that we've made ahead perhaps, but there's only 5 customers that want it. And if you're talking about ice cream, that definitely doesn't hold. So what we tend to see, and let me see if I can do this. I gotta remember which one it is. Let's do it. Okay. So what we see is if this happens, particularly in an ice cream or something that can go bad, is there'll be a downward pressure on prices. Because if you had 6 ice cream cones prepared and you knew that they were going to go bad, wouldn't you start to do what? You're right. If you're a supplier, you're going to decrease the price. So what suppliers are going to do if they've made too many or misjudged demand is they're going to start to lower the price. As they lower the price, some additional buyers will want it. Suppliers lower the price again, additional buyers want it. Again, this continues to happen. And then we ask ourselves, well, how low will it go? And the answer is it's going to be somewhere around $4. Okay, it's going to stop right around $4. So suppliers start by decreasing the price when we have a surplus. Then more people, more demand, the quantity demanded will start to increase, and we will end up somewhere around $4 and somewhere around $7, right back in that equilibrium. Okay. Now, what happens if the price is below equilibrium? And again, I'm just going to put the 4 and 7 back in here so you can kind of see what happens. So here's our $4, again, P sub E, price equilibrium. Our 7 is our quantity equilibrium. Now let's say that the price is lower. We have a bunch of people setting up around us, and so now all of a sudden we're charging less because we want to beat our competition and we're going to do it based upon price. So I'm going to put it here at $2. At a price of $2, I'm going to follow that over. The quantity that is supplied will be something less than 7. So let's say that this is 5. Okay, so this will be the quantity supplied. If we follow this over to the demand curve, the quantity demanded is higher, 9. So quantity demanded. So at any price which is below equilibrium, we're going to end up with a shortage. And basically that means that the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied, and we have an excess. Now, what's interesting in this example, and again, I often refer to this as beer in Kalamazoo on the weekend, because there's lots of people. Imagine 9 people standing in line for a product, and you only have 5 of them. What would you as a supplier do? You would start to either auction it off, right? Or you're going to start to raise the price. So suppliers start by raising prices. As they raise prices, buyers drop out of the market. Again, raising the price, raising the price, raising price, buyers drop out, raise price, buyers drop out. Where's this going to stop at? Somewhere around $4, in a quantity equilibrium around 7. So a shortage, basically, there's an upward pressure on prices because we have a lot of people that want it. Good example of this would have been masks, right? Back in February, March, a lot of people wanted them, couldn't get them. So what did manufacturers do? They started to increase the price. Okay, so here's another all but very nice example as opposed to mine. Here in the first panel, I'll call that panel 1, we have an excess supply. Why? Because the price is above equilibrium. So if the price is above price equilibrium, we end up with a excess of supply or surplus. If that's a perishable product, that can be a real problem. Now, what if the price is below equilibrium? If the price is below equilibrium, we end up with a shortage because the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. And on tests, I would want you to tell me exactly what that is. So you would say there's a shortage of 6 units here. Over here, panel 1, we would say, okay, the quantity demanded is at 4, and the quantity supplied is at 10. So we have a surplus of the difference between those two, 6 units. Okay? All right. So again, when we talk about this, we're saying that price adjusts, right? And what we're looking for is we want to get to price equilibrium and quantity equilibrium. And that occurs where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. It'll be the very first point you want to find in all of your graphs, charts, or what have you. Again, kind of going back to that, these are snapshots in time. It's temporary, okay? Because the markets are always moving. Okay, so in the homework for this chapter, you're going to be asked lots of questions like the ones that I've showed you. And I like this because it gives the 3 steps to analyzing changes. So the first thing, and I like to say to students, don't overthink it. Economics is like dominoes, and I want the first effect. I want this one. Notice that when I talked about some other things, I said, and price remains the same. Well, let's talk about that for just a moment. So let's say that we have supply and we have demand. And an event occurs like an increase in population, let's say, how about a pandemic? And the increase in the pandemic says that people want personal protective gear. So that's going to cause the demand curve to shift outward to D1. Now, our price was here. So P sub B, Q sub B, right? So the demand curve shifted outward for personal protection equipment. That's our first effect. So the demand curve shifted outward. What's our second effect? The price went up. I should say P1. So the second effect back here is price increases. Third effect is that, excuse me, quantity increases. But when we talk about that, we have to be careful, because what happened is suppliers are going to make more that the price went up, right? So now we have another effect following that one. I think I'm here. And so that means supply is going to increase. As supply increases, okay, so hopefully you get what I'm saying, is there is a domino effect. In your problems, focus on the first effect. Because many students, particularly ones that go, okay, this, and this, and this, they give me the effect of way back here, and they're not it's not a wrong answer. It's just not the first effect. So always focus on that first effect, okay? All right, so a change in market equilibrium due to a shift in demand. Okay, one summer, we have very hot weather. What's going to be the effect on the market for ice cream? Well, all right, so let's just look at this. I'm not even going to look at the answers for a moment. Okay, weather. Would weather change in effect? Yes, that would be taste and preferences. So I'm going to draw my demand curve. I'm going to draw my supply curve because I need to start somewhere. And I'm going to start at price equilibrium and quantity equilibrium. Now the weather turns warm. When the weather turns warm, more people might want to buy ice cream. That's fine. That's going to do what? First effect, going to shift the demand curve outward to the right to D1. So that's our first effect. So the demand increases or shifts outward to the right. Second effect is that the price increases. Second effect, price increases. Third effect is quantity increases. Third effect, I'll put Q1 here, is quantity increases. Now, sometimes you have to be careful with this because we know demand shifts out, but it's sometimes difficult to know exactly how much unless they tell you. So on the second test, it's perfectly fine to say that quantity will increase and the price might be ambiguous, because we really just don't know. Or you could say the price will increase and the quantity might be ambiguous. Ambiguous means we just don't know, because it really depends on how far out that shift will be. Let me give you an example. We know that the price in the market is going to lead supply to shift, right? But by how much? So if I say that supply only shifts this much, okay? Supply little, I'm going to say little shift, okay? Then the price, there we go. Our price is going to be here at P2, and our quantity is going to be at Q2. Compare that to a significant shift. I'm running out of colors here. Okay. To a significant shift, and that might be way out here. Notice that the price is now lower, right? Now I want to come here. The price is almost back at equilibrium. So sometimes it's difficult. All I'm doing with that graph, and I know there's lots of lines and it looks really messy, all I'm trying to do is reiterate that these are acceptable answers on test 2, okay? Because sometimes we just don't know how much if they don't tell us specifically. Okay, so here's a very nice looking graph. And again, notice we start off here at our original P sub E at $4, Q sub E or quantity equilibrium at 7. Hot day, that causes the demand curve to shift out. Our new equilibrium, I like to call it P sub 1, is at $5, and our new quantity is at 10, so Q sub 1, okay? Now we know there might be other effects which occur, but how much and to what extent? Okay. All right, so notice, and again, coming back to that, it's okay to say ambiguous because, let me see. All right, come on. Oh, you silly goose. All right, here we go. All right, so what happens to price and quantity when demand shifts? Make sure you can explain a few of the entries in this table using supply and demand diagrams. Okay, so notice when we see the word ambiguous, that means we just don't know because we don't know how far out it goes. So those are acceptable answers. And again, if we're looking at simultaneous things that happen, again, quantity, price. Here's a demand curve, and I'll put supply in a different color because I think that'll make it a little, no, I'll just leave that one. Okay, and then we have our original supply curve. Here's our price equilibrium, and here's our quantity equilibrium. We could have an effect of demand increasing. So now we'll go to blue. Demand's going to increase outward to the right. One thing I can say for sure is that price is going to go up. Yeah, that makes sense. And quantity is going to go up. So I can say that for sure. All right. So demand increases, price increases, quantity increases. But if the supply curve shifts out a little or a lot, we don't know. So at this point is where I'm going to talk about ambiguity. So now the supply curve shifts out. I really don't know if it shifted out a little or if it shifted out a lot. If it shifted out a lot, it could be way out here. So all I can really say about what happens after the supply curve shifts, so I'm going to say supply shifts outward and to the right and increase. All I can say now is that I can tell you there's going to be an increase in quantity, but I can't tell you about price. So I could say price ambiguous. So that's an okay answer. I think that does a little bit better job than my crazy drawing I did a minute ago. Okay, so let's look at an example problem. And then what I want to do is to look at equations, because you notice we looked at a table and we looked at a graph, but we didn't look at an equation yet. So I want to do that. Okay, use a three-step method for analyzing what happens to music downloads. So a fall in the price of CDs. Sellers of music downloads negotiate a reduction in their royalties they must pay. Okay, and then both events occur. All right, so here's our problem. And we want to know, we're looking specifically, our market we're interested in is music downloads. So I'm going to do this. And again, quantity along the X, price along the Y. I'm going to draw a downward sloping demand curve representing music downloads and an upward sloping supply curve representing the supply. So here's our price equilibrium and here's our quantity equilibrium. So that's where we're going to start. Now, a fall in the price of CDs. So the first thing I want to think about here is, what are CDs to music downloads? Well, event A happens to be what? A substitute. Okay, so if the price of CDs decreases, what's going to happen in the market for music downloads? Well, more people will buy CDs, less people will buy downloads. So the demand curve for music downloads would shift inward and to the left. So that's my first effect, D, and I'm going to mark it as an A, okay? Now, when that happens, what's going to happen to the price? So now we have P sub A, and we could say the price decreased. And what happened to the quantity? So that's quantity A. Notice it's less than Q sub B where we started. So quantity decreases. Okay? So that's our first one. All right. So let's look at event B in isolation. So let's think about, again, we're in the market for music downloads. I need a place to start. So I'm just going to start with a demand curve. in a supply curve. And here is our price equilibrium. And here is our quantity equilibrium. Now, in event B, sellers of music downloads negotiate a reduction in the royalties they must pay for each song they sell. So they're sort of the suppliers here, and now they don't have to pay as much. So think about, is that demand or is it supply? And then what happens? Well, you're right, it's a supply, and input price is reducing. So we're going to make more available for sale. So the supply curve is going to shift outward and to the right, S1. Our new equilibrium is, and I'll call it S sub B because we're looking at event B. Here's the price with B, and here's the quantity with B. So looking at in isolation, I can say, okay, first thing that happened, supply curve increased or shifted outward to the right and increased. That's the first thing. Second thing that happened was that the price went down, price decreased. And the third effect that happened was that quantity increased. Now, we want to look at what happens, what happens when both events occur So again, I'm going to draw a little bigger. We're looking at music downloads. So remember, I'm going to go ahead and make a starting point. So this will be demand. This will be supply. And here is price equilibrium and quantity equilibrium. All right, so fall in the price of CDs, we just looked at that in isolation, but now we're looking at it as part of a chain of events. And so the one thing we said is that people won't buy as many music downloads because the substitute decreased in price. So the demand curve is going to shift inward, demand A, which now we know that we have the price at A and let me find it. There we are. And the quantity at A. So let's analyze that. Again, first effect, demand decreased. Second effect, price decreased. Third effect, quantity decreased. Okay. Now we want to look at event B. Event B says that our input price fell. So now we know that when our input prices fall, the supply curve is going to shift outward and to the right. So this is supply B. Remember, we got to find our new equilibrium. It's going to be here. Price and B, quantity B. Now here, again, it could have only shifted out a little bit versus a lot. So I really can't talk about price here, but I can say, okay, the fourth effect when we added event B to the chain of events is that the supply curve increased. I can say that, but I can't really say because of how I drew it. If I would have drawn it just a tiny bit out, somewhere over here, notice that the price would have been actually higher. So I gotta be a little careful there. So all I can really say is that the quantity increased and price will be ambiguous. All right, so here's what we've got. Okay, the two events in isolation. And when both curves shift, notice price ambiguously falls. It's because we're just not sure. Okay, cool. All right, so now we're going to look at going back to equations and functions and solving for price equilibrium and quantity equilibrium. So here's your steps. The first step is you want to get the functions for quantity demanded and quantity supplied. You want to set those two equal to each other, and you want to either solve for price or quantity. In this case, we're going to solve for price, and that'll be our equilibrium price, because remember that price equilibrium occurs where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. So once we have the quantity demand equation and the quantity supplied, we can set them equal to each other and solve for price equilibrium. Then what we're going to do is take either the quantity supplied or quantity demanded equation and plug it back in to get our equilibrium quantity. So here's an example problem. Suppose the demand is given by the equation 500 minus 50p. Now, if it didn't say that it was quantity demanded, I know, because see, notice that the slope is negative here, okay? And P is the price of the good. Okay, so supply is described by the equation. Quantity supplied equals 50 plus 25p. Again, I could tell that is a supply because it's got a positive slope. What's the equilibrium price and quantity? So let's go ahead and do this. In the first step, what we're going to do is we're going to say that we're looking for where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. So I'm going to set both equations equal to each other. 500 minus 50p is equal to 50 plus 25p. I'm going to go ahead and subtract 50 from both sides of the equation. Oh, good Lord. That's going to bother me immensely, so I'm going to erase it. Sorry, but it's just bothering me so bad. I got to write on this goofy little tablet, and sometimes it's hard to do. So let's get that back. That's why everything kind of comes off on a curve with my stuff. So we'll get there, though, I promise. All right, come on, pen. Okay. So, oh, that's not much better, but okay. So we have 450 minus 50p is equal to 25p, right? Okay, so I can add 50p to both sides of the equation. And I end up with 450 is equal to 75p. Now, to isolate my variable, I can divide each side by 75. And I wish I could do that in my head, but I can't. It's that stroke, you know. 450 divided by 75, about 6. So now I know that P sub E is equal to $6. So that's my price equilibrium. Now I want to calculate my quantity equilibrium. To calculate my quantity equilibrium, I just take this price of $6 and substitute it into either the quantity demanded equation or the quantity supplied. I kind of like the quantity demanded equation, but I'm going to go ahead and do that one. So 500 minus 50 times 6, because we just defined P sub E as 6. So let's see what we got. 50 times 6 is 300. So I have 500 minus 300. So quantity equilibrium is at 200. So there's my answers. Okay, so set the two equations equal to themselves. Solve for P and then plug P back in. Okay, I worked it out on the other one. Okay, so now I want to show you a problem. Hi, and welcome to the end of chapter 4, Learning Objective 4, where I wanted to show you a problem, much as you would see in Aplia. In fact, it is one of the problems that you might see for homework. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you. Okay, so I had to do it a little bit differently because I wanted to draw on the slide. So the market price of hamburgers in a college town increased recently. When students in the economic class are debating about the cause of the price increase, some students suggest that the price increase because of the price of beef. Okay, so I'm gonna stop there and I'm gonna take a look. Okay, so we're examining hamburgers, and some students believe it is the price of beef. Price of beef would be an input to hamburger, so that would cause the supply curve, right? And the supply curve would actually shift inward because an input price came up. An important ingredient, okay, has increased. Other students attribute the price increase to a recent increase in college enrollment. Okay, so price of hamburgers and an increase in enrollment. Okay, so that sounds like number of buyers to me. So that would shift the demand curve outward and to the right. And so there we are. Okay, the first group of students thinks that the price of hamburgers is due to the fact of the price of beef. All right, on the following graph, adjust the supply and demand curves to illustrate the first group explanation. So they're saying it's a supply effect for the increase. So what we would do is you would drag either the supply curve or the demand curve to make it look that way. But what I'm going to do is just simply draw it because for some reason my computer doesn't like it when I use the other. So basically I would pull the supply curve inward and to the right because beef being an input to hamburgers would then increase the price. So essentially what we have, our new equilibrium, we would see that our new price, P sub 1, is above the original P sub E. Here's Q sub E, or quantity equilibrium, and then we follow that down, and sure enough, we have Q1. So essentially what's happened in this part of the question, price has increased, that's true, and the quantity has decreased, all else held constant, other things equal. So that's the first part of the question. Okay. The second group of students increase the price of attribute the increase of price of hamburgers to the increase in college enrollment. So again, what is college enrollment to hamburgers? Well, that would be number of buyers. So that would affect the demand curve. The demand curve would shift outward and to the right. So we're going to take, and what you would do is click on this demand, which would help you pull this demand curve over. So we're going to shift this out, demand curve to D1. Here's our new price, P1. It is above price equilibrium here in the black dotted line. Here's quantity equilibrium, black dotted line, and we would see Q1. And here the effect is still a price increase, but the quantity has increased here. So that's kind of our primary difference between the two. Okay, problem goes on. Suppose that both of the events you have just analyzed are partially responsible for the increase in price of hamburgers. Based on your analysis of the explanations offered by the two groups, how would you figure out which possible causes was dominant cause of the increase of price of hamburgers? Okay, so essentially we're going to put the two graphs that we just did together. So we're going to say the first students thinking it was a supply issue, an input price. So I'm going to start here at P sub B, price equilibrium, quantity equilibrium. I'm going to do group 1 in a different color just to keep it straight. So let's see, I'll go ahead and do them in green. So if the price of beef goes up, the supply curve would shift inward and to the right, and the price would increase to P sub 1. And we would have a quantity decrease at Q sub 1. Second group believes that it was the number of buyers. So let's see, if I do that in purple, I think you'll be able to see it. So the second effect is the demand curve is going to shift outward. The second group of students believes that. We'll call that D2, just because I want to keep everything straight here. So if it is the same thing, so now we're going to use the green line, and we have the price, P sub 2, and P sub 2, and the quantity might be back here at quantity equilibrium. If I would have shifted farther out, it would have been an increase in the quantity. So that's kind of unclear. If the quantity equilibriums of hamburgers increased, then the supply shift in the market for hamburgers must have been larger than the demand shift. Okay. Okay. Well, notice, let's go back and let's analyze that. Quantity increased in the demand side, right? So if the quantity, then the supply shift for hamburgers must have been larger. No, that would have made the quantity equilibrium go down. So that's not the right answer. So again, just kind of looking at if I wanted to logic A out, I could have went like this and said, okay, So here's our demand, here's our supply, here's a price, right? So if demand shifts way, okay, if I'm going to shift supply way out here, okay, and I'm going to shift demand out just a little bit, then what would have happened is we're still going to end up with a quantity increase, right? But we would have ended up with a quantity decrease in the opposite effect, okay? Whichever change occurred first must have been the primary. That's not true. If the price increase was small, then the supply shift in the market for hamburgers must have been larger than the demand shift, okay? Price is going to go up regardless, so I'm isolating that one. If the equilibrium quantity of hamburgers increases, then the demand shift in the market for hamburgers must have been larger than the supply shift. So this is very similar to, I like 1 and 4 so far. I put an X through 1, but I want to come back and show you exactly why. Because in the first instance, we had group 1 believing that it was a supply. So supply decreased, right? Supply shifted inward, price went up, and what happened in group 1? Let's go back and take a look. The quantity increased. Okay. For the second group of students who believed it was a demand issue, right? So group 2, oh, excuse me. Excuse me. All right. So group 2, demand curve increased. Excuse me. Price went up, but the quantity went down. All right. So let's match that up and let's look again at 1 and 4 here. If the quantity equilibrium increases, so quantity increases, all right, then the supply shift must have been larger than the demand shift. Okay, that appears true. If the quantity of hamburgers increases, then the demand shift must have been larger than the supply shift. No, that can't be the case because here, notice the quantity is going to go down. And they're saying the quantity went up. So the only statement that's actually true here is number 1. Okay, so sometimes bringing the problem together and taking a look at what the effects are of each thing, then you can kind of take a look at what it would look like. You could draw out the different scenarios if you prefer. Okay, so that is an example problem from chapter 4. Thank you, and I'll see you in our next objective.